Good day. My name is Michelle Levander, and I'm the director of the USC Center for Health Journalism. Thanks for joining us today for our webinar, The End of the Eviction Moratorium and Pandemic Aid. The pandemic is far from over, but crucial COVID-19 protections and benefits are gone. The Supreme Court struck down the CDC eviction moratorium in August, potentially putting millions of Americans at risk of losing their homes as cold weather approaches. The situation is compounded by the expiration of expanded unemployment benefits, which kept some 5.5 million people from falling into poverty during the pandemic. This webinar will explore the end of renter protections. We'll be looking at what it means for the nation's pandemic recovery and the health and well-being of low-income people and their families. We'll talk about the lack of easily accessible eviction data in many jurisdictions and the incomplete portrait we have of the scale of the crisis at a time when an anticipated wave of evictions has thus far failed to materialize. We'll explore who the tenants are who are at greatest risk and which landlords are most predatory about evictions against a backdrop of a slow federal distribution of emergency rental aid. You'll hear tips for journalists looking to convey the desperate struggle of so many families as social supports that kept them afloat have vanished. And we'll explore some of the ways that Byzantine rules interfere with remedies in different court systems around the nation. We'll also delve into the crisis from the perspective of those whose plight is missing from the data, families who are undocumented, and who often simply move or self-evict when threatened by landlords, rather than risk taking their case to court. You can tweet about this webinar at the hashtag Eviction Moratorium. Our three distinguished speakers today are Peter Hepburn, an assistant professor of global urban studies and urban systems at Rutgers University. His research examines how changes to three core social institutions, work, criminal justice, and housing, produce inequality and perpetuate it across generations. In collaboration with the Eviction Lab at Princeton University, he analyzes housing instability and precariousness. We'll also hear from Tina Rosales, an attorney and advocate at the Western Center on Law and Poverty. She works on land use policies, housing protections for people with low to no income, landlord-tenant law, homelessness, fair housing, and other housing issues. And we'll hear from Kristen Capps, a staff writer at Bloomberg City Lab in Washington, D.C. He covers housing, architecture, and the built environment. He previously worked as a senior editor for Architect magazine and has been a contributing writer for the Washington City paper. He was the winner of the inaugural Sarah Booth Conroy Prize for Journalism and Architectural Criticism. This webinar is made possible by the generous support of the National Institute for Healthcare Management Foundation, the Commonwealth Fund, the California Endowment, and individual supporters like you. We will be archiving this webinar at centerforhealthjournalism.org. A word about our format today. We'll be hearing from our panelists first, and then we'll turn it over to our audience for questions. Because we have many people joining us on Zoom, we'll ask you to write your questions into the Q&A panel. You can also write us there if you're experiencing technical problems. We will be archiving this webinar at centerforhealthjournalism.org later today. Peter, let's start with you. What has happened with evictions during the pandemic, and what does this have to do with health? And why haven't we seen the wave of evictions in the data as everyone anticipated?
Thanks for the questions, Michelle, and for the introduction. I want to let me just start sharing the slides. Can you see that okay?
Yep.
Great. So I want to actually start by taking a step back to what things looked like before the pandemic, and then address the questions that you raised. So let's start by talking about eviction a few years ago. What you're looking at here is a map of county-level eviction rates nationwide in 2016. In that year, the Eviction Lab estimates that 3.7 million eviction cases were filed across the country. That's 7 eviction cases every minute. And that was happening when the economy was in pretty good shape. Unemployment rates were below 5% in 2016. So how did we get to this point? At the root of the problem is the unavailability of affordable housing in this country. Rents have increased dramatically over the last several decades, while wages have remained stagnant, especially for low-wage workers. Prior to the pandemic, almost half of renter households were categorized as housing cost burden, which means that they spend more than 30% of their income on rent. A quarter of households spend more than half of their income on housing, and these shares are far higher for low-income households. Housing choice vouchers could, in theory, help, but only about 1 in 5 eligible households actually receive them. Margins are just very thin when you're devoting that much of your income to housing. And the typical renter has little or nothing in savings. There's no sort of private safety net that's available to see them through in the event of a job loss or some sort of unexpected medical bill. The failure to pay rent is by far the most common cause of eviction, and the amounts in question typically aren't all that large. Between 2014 and 2016, the median money judgment on an eviction case was $1,253. Because that total includes legal fees and costs accumulated during the court process, most tenants are actually facing eviction for less than that. And nearly all tenants facing eviction do so without legal counsel. I want to highlight just a few findings from research done by the Eviction Lab. First, the housing crisis extends beyond the big cities that we tend to think of. This isn't just like a New York, Seattle, LA problem. We see really high rates of eviction in a host of smaller and mid-sized cities and in rural areas, especially in the Midwest, the Southeast, and the Sun Belt. 1 in 13 households are evicted every year in Tulsa, Oklahoma, 1 in 9 every year in Richmond. Second, eviction affects some areas and some people more than others. Looking nationally, we've estimated that the eviction rates faced by Black renters are about double those faced by white renters. Every year, more women than men are evicted, and we know that households with kids are at high risk of displacement. We've also documented the outsized impact of a small number of landlords in driving the eviction crisis. Just a few buildings are consistently responsible for a large share of evictions in most cities. As an example, in Tucson, Arizona, the same 295 buildings are responsible for 2/3 of all evictions in the city, year in and year out. Third, eviction isn't always about displacement, especially in jurisdictions that make the eviction process cheap, fast, and easy for landlords. It becomes a default tool for collecting rent, a regularly employed threat that makes property management that much easier, but leaves a lasting mark on tenants' rental histories. Given that this is a talk at the Center for Health Journalism, I wanted to highlight the effects that eviction has on people's health and their well-being, both short-term and long-term. So eviction's been associated with several disabling respiratory and coronary conditions, as well as increased risk of anxiety, depression, mental health hospitalization, and suicide. For women, eviction increases the risk of physical and sexual assault. We know that kids are a risk factor for eviction, but we're still really only scratching the surface when it comes to understanding how those evictions affect kids. So far, we have evidence that it's associated with emotional trauma, lead poisoning, food insecurity, and academic decline. We know that pregnant women going through the eviction process are more likely to give birth preterm or to low birth weight babies. Eviction leaves a permanent mark on tenants' records, one that many landlords treat as a serious red flag moving forward. Therefore, it causes long-term barriers to finding stable housing in the future and forces people to settle for worse apartments in worse neighborhoods. So that's the status quo, the crisis we found ourselves in before the pandemic. And then COVID-19 hits and everything changes. At that point, there was every indication that the economic fallout of the pandemic was going to be felt most acutely by renters. By April of 2020, more than 50 million people living in renter households had suffered a COVID-19 related job or wage loss. And that affected people of color at much higher rates than their white counterparts. Initial numbers from April highlighted this disparity. 61% of Hispanic Americans and 44% of Black Americans said that they or someone in their household had experienced a job or wage loss due to the pandemic. At the same time, according to a Pew study, over 70% of Black and Hispanic renters said that they lacked emergency funds to cover 3 months of expenses. Job and wage losses placed millions of renter households at risk of eviction due to non-payment. In response to the pandemic, the Eviction Lab began collecting eviction filing data in real time in jurisdictions across the country. We call this the Eviction Tracking System, or the ETS. And we built a very detailed and hopefully informative website for it that you can find at evictionlab.org. We now have data from 6 full states and from 31 cities, which lets us monitor what's happening for about a quarter of all renter households in the country. These data allow us to keep tabs on what's happened since the pandemic began, what effect both state and federal eviction moratoria have had, and to offer some suggestion of what may be coming next. What you're looking at here is eviction filings relative to historical average by month across all of the jurisdictions that we're tracking. So you'll see that pre-pandemic, back in January and February of last year, eviction filings were right about at normal, 100% of historical average. They fell in March, and then they bottomed out at April at below 10% of historical average. Through the first 4 months of the pandemic, under the strongest state level state level moratoria and with CARES Act protections in place, filings remain below a quarter of normal. They increased during the CDC moratorium, which is marked here in gray, but they remain below half of normal in nearly all months. What you'll notice here is that in this last month of the series, September, eviction filings haven't spiked since the Supreme Court struck down the CDC eviction moratorium. That's something I'm going to discuss more in just a minute. But before that, I wanted to highlight two things that I think might be interesting to reporters on this call. So first, we recently added a new feature to the ETS website, which is a listing of eviction hotspots. Prior research has demonstrated how heavily concentrated eviction cases are under normal circumstances, and we wanted to evaluate the extent to which that was true during the pandemic as well. So we went through and we calculated which buildings were responsible for most filings during the pandemic. We've done this for 20 cities at this point and are in the process of adding some more. In each of these, we show on the website the top 10 eviction hotspots in the city and the share of all filings that come from the top 100 buildings. So this, for instance, is Jacksonville, Florida. In Jacksonville, there have been over 11,000 eviction cases filed since the start of the pandemic, and over a third of them, 35.8%, come from just 100 buildings. I think an intrepid reporter looking for a story could investigate further, aiming to show how these buildings are potentially linked or where they're clustered. I'm really hoping that Kristen will address this a little bit in his remarks. The other thing I wanted to highlight is the eviction health linkage in light of COVID. There are two dimensions that I think are important. First, the lab has done some work examining the relationship between COVID-19 vaccination rates and eviction filing rates during the pandemic. In every jurisdiction for which we're able to locate data, zip codes with the highest rate of eviction filings since the pandemic began have had significantly lower rates of vaccination against COVID-19. The second thing that's worth noting here is that there appears to be a pretty strong link between eviction and COVID-19 incidence and mortality. There have been a handful of studies now that have been published or available as preprints that have looked at the ending of state-level eviction moratoria over the course of 2020. So this illustration is drawn from a study by Lifeheight and colleagues, which found that lifting eviction moratoria resulted in a 2.1 times higher incidence of COVID-19 and 5.4 times higher COVID-19 mortality. Nationally, the results translated to a total of nearly 500,000 excess cases and over 10,000 excess deaths associated with eviction moratoria lifting just during the summer of 2020. So just to wrap up now, so what's happening now? What do eviction filings look like in the wake of the Supreme Court striking down the CDC eviction moratorium? So these bars are the total number of eviction cases that we've tracked over the course of the last 8 weeks. These last 4 weeks here from August 29th onward are the weeks that follow the end of the CDC eviction moratorium. So you can see that those numbers initially fell slightly, but have been higher the last 2 weeks, above 7,500 cases filed across the jurisdictions that we're tracking. Put into historical perspective, however, that spike is not nearly as dramatic as it appears. The sort of middle and late period of the month is generally when eviction cases get filed. So if you look relative to historical average, you'll see that eviction filings over the last couple of weeks are actually still below 50% of normal. The week of August 29th did exceed 60%, but that's the only week of recent months that has done so. I would note, though, that this elides a lot of variation between sites that we're tracking. So I want to, this is eviction filings by city in the 4 weeks since the eviction moratoria, the CDC moratorium ended. And you'll see that there's a lot of variation here. In New York, eviction filings are below 15% of historical average. Now, of course, there's also an eviction moratorium in place in New York State that accounts for a lot of this. And there are moratoria or additional protections in place in Virginia, in Austin, Texas, in Pennsylvania, in Minnesota, Massachusetts, New Mexico as well. So many of the places on the left-hand side of this plot are places where there's still protections in place. And that's true for about 40% of renters nationwide. On the other hand, we see rates that are looking a lot closer to historical average in other cities in the country, especially cities in Florida. So Gainesville is running only about 4% below historical average over the last 4 weeks. Cincinnati we've seen quite high filing rates. Houston, over the last several weeks, filings have increased dramatically. And there's some indication that filings are increasing in Milwaukee as well. So this is just to show that there is a lot of variation across the country in what we're seeing right now. And if you are working on the story, if this is something you're pursuing, you should be aware of the extent to which that variation is going to play out differently in the places in which you're reporting. So I'm going to stop there and hand this over to Tina.
Thank you so much, Peter. Tina, maybe you could walk us through this from your perch as an advocate and housing attorney.
Yes, I'm happy to do that. Before I do so, I looked at the chat and there was a question about, is tomorrow a deadline to apply for the State Housing is Key program? I'm assuming that's California. No, there is not a deadline to apply for that rental assistance program, especially not tomorrow. So we are encouraging people to report and encouraging tenants to still apply because there is rental assistance available. And by applying between October through March, there are additional protections for an individual. And so thank you for having me. I'm coming at this from an advocate's lens and from a tenants' rights lens. So I was a tenants' rights attorney and defending unlawful detainers in Los Angeles before the eviction protections and as well as during COVID-19. So I'm having a lot of experience with tenants that I would like to highlight. And, you know, similar to what Peter said, evictions have been very frequent occurrence in America since way before the pandemic, and it's going to keep happening after the pandemic. And we also know that women, people of color, and families with children are especially at high risk of not only the evictions, but also at high risk of health concerns that come from evictions and from COVID-19. And so preventing those evictions actually makes sense from a public health and an economic recovery standpoint, because we cannot recover from the health crisis or from the economic crisis without, while thousands of people in thousands of communities are still being displaced when we have money in the bank, and especially in California. And so I'd like to say that financial insecurity is one of the leading causes of housing instability, as Peter described. You know, housing burdens and evictions and financial insecurity also don't impact everyone equally. And so when renters lose their income due to the pandemic, the unemployment benefits were just keeping them afloat. And so now that those funds are gone, we're going to see a lot more people sacrificing basic life necessities to avoid evictions, because what we have seen during the pandemic is that people will do whatever they can to pay their rent. That is their first priority. You know, I had a mother with 4 children, and she had to choose between paying her rent or getting her tire fixed to go to work. And because she didn't want to lose her housing, she paid her rent. What ended up happening is she could not get her tire fixed. She could not make it to work. She lost her job. And now she was served with a notice to pay rent or quit because she couldn't get to work. And so people are making these decisions, not only for their basic life necessities, but also for things like healthcare. We've had, I had a father who was, his young daughter was in cancer treatment. And so he had to choose between going to work and risking contracting the COVID virus and then giving it to his daughter, or not working and risk losing his housing. And so he had to make that very difficult decision every day to go to work, knowing that he may not be able to see his daughter that day. Because it got to the point where his daughter was receiving treatment that was really impacting her health, he had to make the decision to stop working, and he got served with a 3-day notice to pay rent or quit. And since it wasn't necessarily a COVID financial hardship reason, he didn't really have, he couldn't testify that it was COVID related. And so some of the protections in this patchwork of laws that we have, especially in California and nationally, he couldn't afford himself. And so we also know that as of last month, there's about 7 million people that are behind on rent, particularly in California. That means we have a lot of people who can't pay their rent when we have a lot of funding in our state program, and that money is just not getting out to people fast enough. And so with the expiration of a lot of these eviction protections, we are seeing people getting evicted when there's literally money in the bank. And so that could be an outreach problem. A lot of communities who are the intended beneficiaries of the funding they don't have access to the program, whether that's because the program application is very onerous, if the people do not have access to internet, or if there's language barriers. Either way, people are not applying to the program at the rate in which we thought, but also landlords aren't applying to the program in the way in which we thought by giving them 100% assistance. And so, not to be cynical, but in places where there are severe rent control and extreme rent control, it's a business decision, right? If a landlord wants to pursue an eviction, would rather pursue an eviction versus get the rental assistance program. So those are kind of things that tenants and landlords are dealing with every day. And I do want to kind of highlight something that Peter was talking about, and how families do not have emergency funding. And so when we talk about people who don't have rental assistance, they don't have an emergency fund. And so that means they don't have other things like deposits. They do not have move-in costs to move. They will not have money to set up for utilities, first and last month's rent, which is very common in an application. They're probably not going to have funding for medical bills. They may also have little funding for food. And so all of that compounds onto a person. And because they don't have the money for basic life necessities, often a person is forced into homelessness. They have to either live in the streets, live on their car, or if they're lucky enough to live with family members, then they have that option. But that also increases some of the health risks that people are experiencing. So in overcrowding situations, I knew of this woman who had 4 children. She was evicted for non-payment of rent because she lost her job due to COVID. And I don't know how she ended up getting the eviction. I think it was like a court fluke, but either way, she got evicted, moved in with her parents, and now there's over 10 people living in that household. One person contracts COVID, everybody has it, right? So, and that's just what we know with the pandemic. That doesn't take into consideration the anxiety and the stress and the trauma that gets held into a person's body when they experience an eviction. And so to kind of take it back a little and just talk about what we may see within the next coming months and years, is we're going to probably see a big increase in evictions that are not necessarily non-payment of rent, but illegal evictions or self-evictions, and a lot of tenant harassment. And so the pandemic particularly has added urgency to address evictions and the health concerns in general. And the eviction protections, the emergency rental assistance programs, and unemployment benefits, at least in California, kind of kept the eviction rates low. But because the demand for the funds are outpacing the needs and rent is still occurring, and our just cause protections are ending at the end of this month, we're starting to see a slow rise in evictions that are not necessarily non-payment of rent. And so what we're seeing is in jurisdictions where there are protections, there could be an increase of evictions for things like owner move-in, or an increase in evictions for refusing to renew the lease, or 30-day notices, 60-day notices, things like that, where the underlying motive is the non-payment of rent, but that's not actually what we're seeing. And so they don't have those protections that some of the places have. And we're also seeing a huge increase in tenant harassment by landlords. I think it's so important to highlight the stories of the tenants, but there was one tenant who was served 3 60-day notices over a period of a few months. And within those few months, she had 7 anxiety attacks. Her eldest daughter, who was in high school, was unable to finish school and developed depression. And then her middle school son started having panic attacks. Fortunately, she was able to get the landlord to back off, but that's only because she had legal help and community support. I've also seen a case where I personally worked on where he was an undocumented worker living in an illegal unit. And so in Los Angeles, if you're living in an illegal unit, the landlord actually can't accept rent for that. but he lost his income because of COVID. And the landlord shut off his electricity and his water for at least 2 weeks and sent people over to his house to verbally harass him, and then was constantly reporting that he was going to call ICE. And so the impact that it had on that individual is that person ended up developing PTSD-like symptoms. And so we know that it's not only the fear of eviction, but the harassment and going through the eviction process does have an impact on the health of communities, especially in communities that are already vulnerable to a lot of these health ailments. Like Peter said, it leads to high stress, anxiety, depression, insomnia. I've had clients develop ulcers and chronic health conditions. And as an attorney representing people in unlawful detainers, going into court every day, knowing that I was the only attorney for the one individual, when most of the people who are landlords have representation and most of the tenants are unrepresented, I also developed symptoms of anxiety. And I can only imagine what my clients are going through. And as a post-eviction world, when we're kind of thinking what happens at the end of the eviction, it's not just, you get evicted and that's it, it's over. The impact, it'll impact a person's life for years to come. So it can stay on an individual's record. A person may be automatically denied from housing going forward because they have an eviction on their record. Their life may be completely upended. They could lose their job. They retain, they're in a cycle of trauma and stress and housing insecurity that will really have a ripple effect through their lives. And so I think it's important as reporters to center not only the eviction, but also what happens after the eviction, and definitely to center voices for people who are in the community and that this is actually happening to, because it can get very easy to sort of get lost in the laws and things that we have, and not realizing that actual people are really suffering from evictions and the after effects of it. And Michelle, I don't know if I'm at my time yet.
I think you might be. So let's turn to Kristen, and then we'll circle back to you for questions. And Kristen, as the journalist in the room, how do you approach coverage of the eviction crisis? What story angles should reporters be exploring as the weather gets colder and the economic situation for many families continues to worsen?
Thanks, Michelle, for that question, and thanks for having me here today. I want to talk through one part of a story that I wrote a couple of weeks back, connected to something that Peter discussed earlier, and use that as kind of a point to touch on a few things that I think have been really helpful in my reporting on evictions. And that is, the data base that Peter talked about regarding addresses with the most evictions. This represents large landlords, large apartment buildings, generally, where the most evictions have been filed during the pandemic. And the way that Eviction Lab presents this data is they have, the 100 top addresses or evictors over the pandemic, and then they have the 100 top over the last 8 weeks, or whatever I think the time frame is, recent versus kind of historical pandemic evictions. And I found that this is a really interesting way of looking at it, because we can take from that as reporters, patterns in evictions. The example I would point to is in Houston. I was just kind of digging through these numbers, looking at addresses, trying to see, what I could find just by plugging in addresses and looking at the actual, properties. And I kept coming up with one property management company when looking through Houston evictions, and that was Villa Serena Communities. So I decided to dig a little deeper into this particular property management, and I'll just kind of go over briefly what I found. Villa Serena Communities, popped up over and over. It was, the number 7 top evictor. That was Breckenridge at City View. Another apartment complex called Serena Woods was number 11. Another apartment complex called Crescent at City View was number 17, and so on and so on and so on. And with these large landlords, they often have, these kind of naming conventions that can, be a tip. If you're just looking at a big spreadsheet, you can sort of see these names popping up over and over and over again. And that's one I looked at. And in Houston, all of these apartment buildings, all of them are located within kind of a single suburban Houston area called Greenspoint, which is, a majority minority neighborhood. It has, in Texas, where I'm from, I know this area it's by its derogatory nickname of Guns Point. This is an area where housing precarity is really rampant, and this single property owner has 6,000 units in this single community. So this is a very large, prominent property owner in the community, and is using eviction as a kind of rent management tool, both for the pandemic, during the pandemic, and right now. So finding that large landlord, I then plugged the company name, which is VSC Management, into the Small Business Administration database, found that in fact they did receive 2.7 million in Paycheck Protection Program loans. So this is a landlord that in one hand is, getting money from the federal government to stay afloat, and with the other hand, mass evicting many hundreds of tenants over the course of the pandemic. Looking further, I found the owner. His name is Steve Moore, the company's founder and owner, and looked at some historical reports. Found, for example, a 2017 report by the local CBS affiliate about Steve Moore, and it was kind of this puff piece praising him for collaborating with law enforcement to reduce crime in his properties, which is, I think, a way of saying, although this report didn't put it that way, of like policing his own properties. And in that report, he talks about how he lives in his own in one of the buildings he manages, which means, this, if you look at the Eviction Lab database, you can see that Steve Moore is responsible for evicting, 18 of his neighbors just over the last 8 weeks. So that is, a way I think you can use the data to find really powerful local stories by, pointing to the data we have in evictions, looking at maps and historical records and historical storytelling in our communities, and looking at federal programs that exist or have come about since the pandemic. As a national reporter, I hope I can dig deep into stories about Houston and St. Louis and Kansas City. But, all of these places have really different court systems, have really, different eviction machines or tenant protection systems. And so those things are really important. So as a reporter, when I am writing about a community where I haven't reported before, one of the first things I try to do is get in touch with, local tenant attorneys, since they are very familiar with both the laws in local and state, and also, can tend to put me in touch with people who are familiar with how, federal systems such as emergency rental assistance, the CARES Act, when that money was really pressing, whatever it is, how that money flows and how it actually gets to or does not get to tenants. One of the things I've learned about covering evictions over the pandemic, and I guess before, is that judges are more accessible than a non-court reporter might guess. So talking to judges, I think, has been really invaluable when reporting on evictions in different places, because judges can really explain why how a rocket docket in Houston or Indianapolis works. They can really explain where the rubber meets the road when it comes to the White House efforts to slow down evictions and what, both state law allows, local law allows, and just what kind of court precedent really allows. Judges have had so much leeway in deciding when and whether the eviction moratorium applies or doesn't. And just asking them questions has been really invaluable in my own reporting and my own understanding of how all this stuff works. The final thing I might say about reporting on homelessness, especially as we come to this winter, this first winter without a federal eviction moratorium, and after a lot of state and local moratoria will have expired, is that homelessness care is a system too, and it's incredibly complex in any place. The interplay between continuums of care, whatever the local continuum of care is, and the constellation of nonprofits, charities, churches, hospitals, and jails that provide care or shelter for people who are experiencing homelessness. So understanding in a way how that works at any given place, I think, is really crucial to reporting on this issue. And unfortunately, it's really difficult because in most jurisdictions, or at least most that I've kind of reported on, a lot of the people who are working on this don't understand exactly how all of these things interlock. A recent story I wrote is about a White House program, a White House push called House America, which is an effort to get cities to pledge to both provide housing for a specific number of or specific share of people locally who are experiencing homelessness, and to build a specific number of affordable housing units to put those into the pipeline for development. One of the biggest challenges for any jurisdiction dealing with homelessness is that just it's not guaranteed that people are on the same page, that they're aligned in their commitments, aligned in their views or practices. And the politics involved with this, between all of these people who are committed to caretaking in some sense, is just really complex. And understanding that, I think, is really core to the mission of reporting on this issue, but very difficult. So I'm not sure that's at 10 minutes either, but I'm going to kick it back to Michelle, since I think we do have a lot of questions coming.
That's right. Yeah, thank you so much, Kristen, and thank you to all of our panelists. We're going to open this all up to everyone in our audience. We already have some questions in the Q&A panel, but feel free to send us others. And I actually wanted to start out with a question that's in the chat but please do put your questions in the Q&A, from Heiner, I'm hoping I'm pronouncing this right, Giese, who said that he's in Milwaukee County. He just ran the eviction filings for 30 days and that evictions are down. Considering the backlog, which should be a factor, the tsunami prediction is a myth, he says, and then goes on to say, in responding to the comment that Tina said about a family with a woman with children being really out of luck, that tenants with children do have an emergency fund now. Since July, your example of a woman with 4 children is getting at least $1,000 per month in federal child credit. So I just wanted to open this up. Peter, maybe you could reply to this, and then Tina may also have a response to just that comment, and then we'll go back to everybody's questions.
Yeah, sure. Hi, Heiner. Yeah, so I do want to emphasize that eviction filings are still well below historical average in Milwaukee. They have been, I think, the city of Milwaukee generally, and the real estate interests in the city of Milwaukee have coordinated remarkably effectively to keep filings low in the city over the last year. Eviction filing rates last summer were quite high. and there was a concerted effort that helped to bring those numbers down. And I think that's a credit to all of the actors who are participating there. It is worrisome that those numbers now appear to be trending upwards again, and that's a cause for concern. I think the point that that the new child tax credit offers a potential lifeline is a good point and an important one. I think especially with expanded unemployment benefits expiring recently, that additional $600,000 a month is going to make a big difference for a lot of people. On the other hand, we also know that while many households are eligible for this, if they don't regularly file taxes, non-filer households had to proactively register with the IRS to get access to these benefits this year. Otherwise, they can claim them next year while filing taxes. And the process of actually doing that has been relatively confusing, and it's not clear that everybody who should be receiving these checks actually is receiving these checks right now. So much like the rollout of emergency rental assistance has been problematic, I think the child tax credits going especially to low-income households may be less direct than we would hope.
And Tina, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, without giving away too much personal client information, I will also just say that it is difficult for low-wage workers and low-income folks to get access to those public benefits. But we also have to consider the amount of money that they're getting with the cost of the way of living. So LA is particularly expensive to live in, and the rent is very expensive, and the cost of living in general. So those are just some considerations to think about when we're discussing, individuals' situations.
Thank you. We have a question from Gina Contino, who says, I'm a housing reporter in South Carolina and want to show through a story in the eviction moratorium how the Southeast has higher rates of evictions. Evictions in Greenville went down a bit during the CDC moratorium, but we still had about 12,000 during COVID. It's hard to break the mindset that evictions only happen in big cities like New York City. Is there any research or experts that you would all recommend on evictions in the Southeast? And let me just say that there's another question further down saying data being shown for cities don't include many cities from the South. Is that because cities in the South don't provide such data? So they seem sort of like paired questions, and maybe you all can try to address both of those.
I would suggest that the Eviction Lab's national database of evictions, which covers the years 2000 to 2016. We have a map or a whole series of maps that you can look at that I think do emphasize the extent to which eviction rates are clustered in the Southeast, throughout the Sun Belt, in the Rust Belt to some extent, and would allow you to compare various jurisdictions throughout that region. To the question of why we don't have data from the South, I would tend to argue that we actually have relatively good data from the South right now during the pandemic. I mean, we've got 2 jurisdictions in South Carolina, 3 in Florida, several in Texas. There are plenty of places where we simply can't collect these data because court systems don't make them readily available. But there are a fair number of places throughout the South that do, and so we have tried to include those, especially because we know that this is a part of the country where that sees a lot of evictions under normal circumstances. The part of the country that's really missing from our map is the West Coast, and that we unfortunately we just don't have as good a way of tracking. In large part in California, because sealing laws make it difficult to access these sorts of records. There are, I suppose, a number of other resources or researchers that are doing important work on evictions in the South. If you reach out to me, I'd be happy to suggest a few people.
Thank you. And we have a question for Kristen from Markham. How did you obtain the information about Steve Moore getting paycheck protection from the federal government?
There's a couple of just searchable databases. I'm forgetting who maintains, like, there's one that the Small Business Administration just has. You can just look it up. There's another one maintained by, it'll come to me in a minute. But you know, it's pretty easy to take a company name and look it up. The real difficulty is that a lot of landlords, a lot of property owners use LLCs. So you need to know, you know, the name of the LLC in order to look that up, and that's going to be shielded in some cases. But I would say, you know, to step back broadly, because we are talking just about data accessibility a lot here. It's really hard. One way that I found is an approach in places where you're just not seeing the numbers provided on Eviction Lab database, because it's just hard to get those numbers, is to find the attorneys who file the evictions. This tends to be a very small number of people who work for a large, you know, for landlords who represent a lot of units. You know, in Baltimore area, for example, there are really about 5 attorneys who you see every single day in housing court. I know all their names. So do all of the, you know, local housing attorneys, and these people just do all the processing. Some of them are willing to talk to reporters, some of them aren't, but you know, that's one way to understand patterns of eviction locally where the data are a bit obscured. And the ProPublica is the group that runs one of the paycheck protection databases. It's very good. It has some searchable features that the SBA, I believe, doesn't. So that's one. I use it. I look up everyone, you know, friends, coworkers, neighbors. I want to see who's getting PPP.
Thank you. And we have a question. And before I read this, folks, just a reminder to put your questions in the Q&A panel, not the chat, so we don't miss it. We have a question from Camila Vallejo, who says, do you have any tips on how to go beyond the data and find people experiencing eviction? What's the best way to do so as someone who doesn't have too many connections yet?
Court. Go to court. You know, unfortunately, it is just very easy to find stories of real despair happening every day in housing court. So I really think the problem is just that a lot of reporters don't have the time or bandwidth, and a lot of newsrooms don't have the resources to commit to someone, you know, stalking housing court. But that's where you find, you know, not just tenants who are coming in and dealing with this, but the attorneys who are filing all of the evictions, the judges who are processing all the evictions, or sometimes, you know, trying to prioritize other cases and working in some sense with the White House on that push to slow down pandemic evictions. But it's all really happening locally at the court.
We have a lot of questions about data, how to get data on evictions. A more specific question from Elisa Barba saying, is it possible for the Eviction Lab to run the numbers on a city not included in your database right now, specifically to find the landlords with the highest numbers of evictions? Would love to see the data in San Diego. So maybe, Peter, you could take a moment, because I feel like there's maybe 3 or 4 questions asking really fundamental, like, where do I get this, to very specific questions about Eviction Lab, saying, you know, where is data available, and what, you know, how Eviction Lab is trying to fill in the gap, and what's just not there.
Sure. So like I said, we currently track in real time filings from 6 states and 31 cities. You know, there are any number of jurisdictions that are not included in our list that we would love to be able to track. And in some cases, we can't do that just because the data aren't made publicly available, or they're only made available but behind a paywall that is too expensive for us to venture behind. And sometimes just because time resources are limited and there's only so much we can do. So we have explored partnerships in some cases with journalists in these jurisdictions who have gone and made records requests of court systems and who then report the data back to us, and we're able to process it and make it available to them through the ETS. And if there are people out there working in places that we're not tracking these data who think that they would be able to do that, we could explore doing more of that sort of work. But ultimately, our resources are limited, and there's only so much we can do to fill in the map here. And I think that highlights, though, perhaps a much broader problem about how we systematically don't collect and record data about eviction and about renters in this country. We worry about the eviction crisis, and we spend a lot of time thinking about how we could address it, but without good data about where it's actually happening and who it's affecting, we're hamstrung in doing so. And I think it's it's important to recognize that the federal government does not collect almost any data about eviction, and that that federal inaction kind of leaves a void and sort of allows states and cities to similarly turn a blind eye to the plight of renters in their communities.
I want to add something to that, and it's just re-emphasizing the point that I think Peter has made, that eviction filings can only tell us so much, and that we have to dig a little further than the charts to get at important stories. Earlier someone asked about eviction filings in Milwaukee, and I think was kind of making the point that this tsunami is a myth. And I have a detail about Milwaukee that I never really got to report out, which is that just maybe around June 2020, some point during summer 2020, this one landlord dumped like 500 eviction filings into the system and produced this huge spike for Milwaukee. And it was just a single landlord who decided he had enough and tried to evict every single one of his tenants at once. Now, so eviction filings are somewhat down from that level because this landlord has been convinced that this is not a fruitful way to run his business and isn't trying to do that in court all the time. So that's just one thing I never really got to report out about squirreliness in a single city's spiky graph. At the same time, so many, of the, small landlord local evictions are just not apparent in these things because they are really lockouts, intimidation, false paperwork. And so while sometimes the data can kind of lend weight to the argument, a very active argument about large landlords being worse than small landlords, in fact, small landlords' kind of invisibility within the legal system is something to really keep in mind while covering housing precarity.
And I wanted to turn to Tina to talk about something that she said in our earlier conversations, but it really speaks to also the how varied these situations are from one jurisdiction to another, which is like the rules of the court on filing and how that can help or harm people getting different kinds of deadlines that contradict each other. Could you just illuminate that a little bit, Tina?
Yeah, so it's important to note that we're working with a patchwork of laws, right? Every jurisdiction is going to have a different law or different rules applying to evictions, whether that's for ceilings or how many days a person has to file an answer. And that could even change in one area. So for example, San Francisco has different laws than in big cities in Portland versus the Antelope Valley. And so all of those laws are going to be completely different. And it's really difficult when we're looking at data and trying to assist people on how to navigate those laws, especially if you do not have a legal background. And even for those who have a legal background, with the CDC order and a bunch of different laws constantly getting implemented at varying times with different deadlines, it can be very confusing. And so one of the things that I think we need to really highlight is the fact that nationally, 81% of landlords have legal representation in unlawful detainer court, where only 3% of tenants have representation. So even if they do have laws that protect them, they may not be able to access those laws because they don't have the legal background to understand or to pursue their case. And so when we think about it, we also have to think about the fact that there is just a power disparity in UD court. And maybe one of the better ways is to really, focus on getting legal representation and funding legal services for tenants so that they can have access to the laws that were created to protect them. And I did want to put one highlight on the data, other than going to court, since court is a very traumatic experience for people who are facing a UD. You could also try just talking to individuals on the street. I mean, there's a lot of tent cities coming around the nation, and most of the individuals who live in those tent cities have been evicted. And another place is just to check for small claims actions, because oftentimes an eviction will show there will be a judgment for either small claims or civil claims, and you'll see it'll say something like Mexico housing, and there will be a judgment there. So that could be an indication that there was an eviction and there was other things that were going on. So just kind of thinking a little outside of the box rather than focusing just on evictions, you can focus on money judgment. That will also impact somebody's life.
Thank you. And we have another question for you from Chika Ojokwu, who says, Tina, you mentioned how not as many people are applying for programs as expected. What do you think should be done to have households be aware of and take advantage of the many programs available for them?
Outreach and education is probably the biggest one. We know that a lot of people who are the intended beneficiaries are not able to access the application because they don't know it exists. And some communities have such an ingrained bad relationship with the government, whether that's because ICE gets called or if, for whatever reason, there is an inherent distrust of government organizations. And, like we saw in California, a bunch of PACE loans go out that ended up harming a bunch of people. And so it really comes down to education and rebuilding the trust with some of these government assistance programs. There was one of the programs, I can't remember which state it was, but was requiring like social security numbers and proof of citizenship. So people in immigrant communities couldn't even access the application. And so some states add additional barriers that is not necessarily within the federal guidelines. Only recently, the Treasury guidelines allowed for self-attestation, which was not something that was accessible in a lot of the states. And it's interesting to think that, when a person of low income who actually needs the assistance, we put up all of these barriers to ensure that that person, quote unquote, deserves it or actually needs the assistance rather than just trusting that the individual needs it. And then on the flip side, we don't really have those same barriers when it comes to, like corporations and businesses and some other things. So it's kind of just one of those power dynamics that we have to discuss in California and really figure out why we put barriers for those who need it versus other places.
We have a question from Anjana Nagarahan Bhutani, who says, can you elaborate on why it is hard to get more detailed data in California and any ideas on how we can break through that process?
California has sealing laws that will mask an unlawful detainer if they meet certain requirements, which is great because we do know that an eviction on a person's record can stop them from obtaining housing in the future. It could also act as a barrier to future employment. But it's unfortunate because then we can't capture the data that we really need in California. So we're weighing the interest of a person's privacy interest versus the public interest of accessing data. And we've lent more on, the privacy part of it. There are ways that you can access this data in California, specifically by checking small claims or civil actions for money judgments. You can go into court if you have the time and speak to individuals who are facing unlawful detainers, talk to people on the streets. But that's kind of one of the problems that we're facing when we look at California's data. And I'm sure Peter has much more to say about California's inaccessibility.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think you hit the main point, which is that these sealing laws they have real benefits for people who are facing eviction. But for research or for policymakers who are looking to address eviction in the state, it does limit what they're able to see and what they're able to do. As for the question of how you break through it, I mean, I think the suggestions that Tina makes are helpful to give you, some insight, but it's not clear, how representative that would be necessarily. And whether there's a way to more systematically break through, I'm suspicious. I've had calls with representatives from the Attorney General's office in California, and they would like to better understand eviction patterns in the state, and they can't access these data either. And so I think, it's an ongoing problem, and a dilemma.
It's a question from Gina Contino. Is there an easy way to see how many evictions result in removals, or would you have to go through each case within the magistrate courts?
Generally, you can think of the eviction process, like what we're tracking with the eviction tracking system is filing of eviction cases. Normally, there's a step before that, which is landlords providing notice to tenants. Then they file an eviction case. Then the case is heard, and if there's a judgment, that's a good indicator that someone has been evicted. But then the final step is actually the execution of a writ. A writ of possession. This is when the sheriff shows up to evict someone. And people choose, people can give up and move before they reach those final stages of the process. So someone can receive notice from their landlord and just leave at that point. And they may never receive an eviction judgment in that case, but it's hard to say that they weren't in some way evicted. It's just sort of the moving toward informal eviction or what's sometimes called self-help eviction. But you can trace the percentage of cases that move from being filed to resulting in an eviction judgment, which under normal circumstances is usually between 40 and 50%, although that varies between jurisdictions. But that's one way you could go about tracking it. Getting writ data on the actual execution of evictions is somewhat more complicated.
We have a question for Tina from Dana Ullman, who says, do you have any information on the gray area of landlords selling a home or building with renters and what tenant rights they have in that situation? A pattern I'm seeing in my reporting on the north coast of California, Mendocino and Sonoma counties, are many essential workers who self-evict after they are told the house they rent is being sold, wondering what their options are. This is there's critical affordable housing shortage here, and several families have become homeless or move into shared housing, which is a growing public health concern during the pandemic.
Yeah, so it's really going to depend on the jurisdiction. If they have protections, just cause protection, so if there has to be a reason for the eviction. I think this question is a very pointed one, and I'm happy to discuss kind of the details about it because it is going to get a little tricky and probably take way more time than we have. But just in general, we are also seeing an uptick of, like I said, non-payment of rent evictions. So those are 3-day notices, owner move-ins, Ellis Act evictions, which are selling the property or going out of business. And that's for California. Across the states, across the nation, when there aren't those protections, we are also hearing about increases in those types of evictions. So it's, like I said earlier, it's really important to know the patchwork of laws where tenants have protections and they may not, and then what y'all can do to sort of highlight some of those stories. But I'm happy to take this one offline since it's going to require some legal digging.
Thank you, Tina. And for our final question, I'm going to turn to Kristen and ask him, as you look forward, what do you see as the stories that journalists should be thinking about and just the trends to watch?
Well, an important story that I'm following really closely now, and I think will evolve over the months to come, is How's America, which is the Biden administration's push to get cities, states, territories, tribal governments to commit, to make this public pledge to reduce homelessness and to set, tangible targets for doing so. So this is going to, there's a rollout of about 25 jurisdictions, cities and states in the kind of initial cohort, but they're hoping to, get hundreds of mayors, county executives, governors, tribal leaders to commit to this. So I think that's really kind of an easy question for reporters to be asking locally, not just like, is our city going to take this pledge, but like, how are we going to really fulfill that? Like, how's that going to work? The emergency rental assistance money is still very slowly kind of trickling out. And, the White House is still trying to get courts and city leaders and states kind of all on board and get messaging out on this. That money is going to be around for a while. There's also money in the CARES Act that is still being spent, that still will be spent, especially when it comes to money for aid for people experiencing homelessness or aid to prevent homelessness. That money has a much longer sunset. So following that really closely is important, but also following what states aren't doing. There's a considerable amount of money for states and local governments in the American Rescue Plan. To tip my hand, I'm working on a story about a state that is not pledging to use any of this money toward housing or towards rental aid or on homelessness, and which has a lot of local leaders and advocates asking, why not? So, and that's just one state. There are a lot out there that have a ton of, money to spend under ARP and haven't yet committed or shown exactly how they're going to do that. So that's a very important storyline that will be developing. Finally, I think that encampments is a really pressing story. You see a ton of journalism about this coming out of California and not, as much in a lot of other places. Where I live in DC, the encampment that's closest to me has grown from, a park where maybe a couple of people have slept to like a very evolved community over the last year and a half. How cities are dealing with that is incredibly important and mostly counterproductive. So, and you actually see the White House pushing cities to stop clearing out encampments as a reactive policy and to try to do something more proactive to help the people who are in these situations. So whether cities take up that pledge to stop clearing enactments or other counterproductive policies, I think is going to be something that's really important to report on, especially going into winter.
Thank you so much, Kristen. And with that, I want to thank all of our wonderful panelists and to thank the audience for all of their questions, which have been really thoughtful. We'll be sending everybody a survey asking for your feedback on today's program and for your ideas and other topics of interest. Please take a moment to complete it. As a reminder, we'll be archiving this webinar a little later today at centerforhealthjournalism.org. Thank you so much and have a great afternoon.